Everything God created is good, and he created it out of nothing, out of no need for himself, which is love. Now we're going to focus on where things went wrong. Because if everything is good and we look around at the world today and turn on the news, we can see very clearly that something must have been dismantled. When we examine what it means to dismantle the good in God's creation, we talk about it in terms of sin. But there had to be a first sin which began this, and that's the story we know of Adam and Eve. And we call that the original sin, the first sin. And this sin has made an impact on all of us. We have inherited the effects of that sin as a community and as a society and individually. So we can look at all the specific implications of that, but today we're just going to reflect on what is sin and how does it happen. I think in order for us to get a clue about that, it's helpful for us to look at the story of Adam and Eve. The story of Adam and Eve really explains to us how evil entered into the world. It didn't come from God, it came from us. And it also came from another creature, God's angel, Lucifer, who fell and who tempted Eve. And so, in a sense, it's the combination of our choice to listen to the evil one and act on what he's told us to do. The opposite of that, of course, would have been if Adam and Eve had listened to God and obeyed him instead. So here God is giving Adam and Eve the freedom to eat from any of the trees in the garden. But he does ask us not to eat of the one tree in the garden. He doesn't do this because that's his tree and he's very possessive about it. But rather, he does it because it's not good for our own sake. The tree of knowledge of good and evil. So how does it take place that Adam and Eve would eat from this tree after everything that God had done? He had created the most beautiful universe. He had created us from nothing. We didn't necessarily deserve that, but he just did it anyways. And how could we respond to that with ingratitude and disobedience? What had to happen in the mind of Adam and Eve in order to twist it so? Well, we're going to examine that because it's very important because it still plays a role in our life. It's the science of temptation. So here, Eve approaches the tree and the serpent is there, but it's important to note that Adam was charged with the responsibility of guarding the garden. So the implication here is that Adam didn't do his job very well. Second of all, Eve is confronting the most cunning and evil and deceptive demon and seems to have this absence of Adam. If he's standing there, he's being quiet. And if he's not there, he's not defending his wife from one of the most destructible and dangerous beings that God has ever created. And so what we recognize in this, that God has created this angel, but this angel has become dangerous because of his own free choice. What we see here is this temptation that the devil wants us to join with him in rebellion against God. And he does this very craftily. He tells Eve 3 lies. The first lie is, did God really tell you not to eat of any of the trees? Of course, that is a lie. So what the devil's doing here is he's exaggerating God's moral law. You know, how often do we get tunnel vision with the one thing we're not allowed to do? There's so many other things that we can retrieve joy from, but that one thing that we want to do, we only think about that. We become obsessed with it. And that's exactly what the devil is doing. Eve, of course, corrects the devil. She says, no, not any of those trees, but just this one tree. But she shouldn't have even had that conversation with him. The moment that she knew that he was exaggerating God's moral law, making God out to be some sort of tyrant, she should have said, I'm sorry, but I love God, and I will not listen to someone who speaks about him like that. But she continued to dialogue because she was curious. Why might she have been curious? Because he was sowing the seed of fear within her own heart. Here God had created her, but maybe God had some sort of agenda that was deep down for the destruction of Adam and Eve and the human race. That's the deception that the devil is trying to create and engender within her soul and her mind. And so that's very unfair to God. He doesn't deserve that kind of calumny, but that's the way the devil deceives. So Eve continues the dialogue, and she says, well, I'm going to die if I eat of this tree, if I even touch it. And the devil says, surely you won't die. So the implication of that is God as a father is not only a moralizing tyrant, but he's also a liar. Why might he be a liar? Well, the devil continues. God doesn't want you to eat of that tree because then you'll become like him. In other words, God's a tyrant and he's moralizing you because he's in competition with you. He wants to keep you oppressed from fulfilling your full potential. So Eve listens to all these lies that are passively being sown in her mind and her soul and her heart. And it's enough to make her take control and take that apple for herself or whatever fruit it was. Then, of course, because sin doesn't like to be alone in sin, she extends it to Adam. And Adam reluctantly receives it. He receives it without argument, without explanation, without dialogue. He's not really thinking for himself, is he? He's just doing whatever. That's a weakness too. And so here, both Adam and Eve have entered into sin, and this has broken their relationship. Why does it break their relationship? Because God is no longer a good father. He's a liar, he's a tyrant, and he's in competition with me. And with that, there's no paradise. How could we ever live in the world that God has created if we're always going to see it as some vindictive God behind everything that moves? The only thing that we can do is, if that's the case, take things into our own hands, define for ourselves what is good. And what we see as a result of that attitude is the world we live in today, mixed with good and evil, rather than just being a paradise where everything's good. I think one of the dangers that comes from the original sin, reflecting on the reality of sin, is the death of faith. The faith, that lack of belief that God is generous, to see his laws and commandments as oppressive rather than actually guiding us into a place of peace and happiness. When we reflect on the purpose of our existence, God just wants us to enter into a loving relationship with him. But when we walk away from that and take things into our own hands, what we're ultimately doing is taking from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And what does it mean to say that we're taking from the tree of knowledge of good and evil? It means that we are defining for ourselves the difference between good and evil. Some people will say that the tree was a way of keeping us enlightened, that God didn't want us to be enlightened. He wanted us to remain in ignorance. But that's a very shallow reading of this passage, because they already knew the difference between good and evil. God said, don't eat of that tree, eat of any of the other trees. What they're doing with this tree is they're saying, I don't trust God's version of the difference between good and evil. I'm going to determine that for myself, because God doesn't have my best interests at heart. And that lie is what produces the fear, which then generates sin, the sin of pride. So in our next video, we're going to talk about how to get out of that. God bless you.